He thought he was the architect of his own destiny. He believed he could control everything. The blood on his hands, the borders of his territory, and the distance between himself and the only woman he ever loved. But fate has a brutal way of tearing down a king. Im Kyu-sung was convinced that by breaking Serena Moon's heart, he was saving her life. He thought a cold lie was better than a shallow grave. But in a dark alleyway under a sky that refused to stop weeping, his grand plan turned to ash. It wasn't a rival syndicate or a police raid that brought him to his knees. It was the weight of a dying woman in a white dress, and the realization that the bullet meant for him had found her instead. This isn't a simple romance. It's a saga of lethal secrets, a desperate race against a medical clock, and a betrayal that started from inside his own throne room. Think you know how far a man will go to fix a broken vow? Let's get into it. The rain in Seoul didn't just fall, it punished. It turned the neon lights of the city into blurry streaks of red and blue, washing away the city's sins and replacing them with a cold, relentless flood. Inside the back of his custom-built black sedan, the atmosphere was pressurized and sterile. The air-conditioned silence smelled of expensive tobacco and fresh ink from signed contracts. Im Kyu-sung, the most feared man in the underworld, adjusted his silk tie and looked out the window at the streets he commanded. To the world he was a monster. To himself he was a ghost haunting his own life. Across from him sat his chief of staff, a man whose loyalty was bought with enough gold to sink a ship. The shipment from the docks is secure, Chairman, the man said, eyes fixed on a glowing tablet. The board of directors is ready for your signature. By morning you'll own the Western District. Good, Kyu-sung replied, his voice like grinding gravel. He felt a familiar hollow ache in his chest, one he'd lived with for 3 years. Ever since the night he told Serena he never loved her and watched her walk away into the darkness. Should we schedule the celebration for tonight? The advisor asked. No, Kyu-sung grunted, his eyes catching a movement in the shadows of an alleyway as the car slowed. Celebrations are for men who still have something to lose. The silence of the custom sedan was a lie, a thin veil of luxury that had been violently ripped away. Im Kyu-sung stood in the center of the rain-slicked asphalt, his custom-tailored wool suit, once a symbol of absolute authority, now a heavy, sodden weight dragging at his shoulders. The sharp, clean scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco that usually defined his world had been replaced by the metallic iron tang of fresh blood. It stained his white silk shirt, spreading like a blooming, jagged flower where Serena's head rested against his chest. He looked down at her, his hands shaking with a tremor that no enemy had ever been able to provoke. In the harsh, artificial glare of the car's headlights, Serena Moon looked terrifyingly fragile. Her white dress, once pristine and ethereal, was plastered to her skin, translucent and ruined by the grit of the Seoul streets and the widening crimson pool. This was the woman he had treated like a delicate porcelain doll, pushing her into the shadows of his past to keep her from the very violence she was now soaked in. Move, he roared, his voice cracking with a raw, jagged edge that silenced the drumming rain. His men, elite soldiers who had watched him order executions with a bored yawn, stood frozen by the sight of their king's total collapse. Kyu-sung didn't wait for them. He scooped her up, his bespoke leather shoes splashing through a filthy puddle, the king of the city reduced to a desperate man running through the grime. As he ducked back into the Maybach, the contrast was a physical blow. The plush, heated leather seats, crafted for comfort and power, now felt like an insult as he laid her broken body across them. He pressed a hand to the wound, his expensive platinum cufflinks catching the dim light as they became slick with her life force. Everything he owned, every building he possessed, and every man he commanded felt like ash in his mouth. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but the world had found a way in through a single leaden point. Drive, he whispered, a command that carried the weight of a funeral march. If she dies, this city burns with her. The heavy rhythmic thrum of the rain against the Maybach's roof transformed into the haunting echo of a different night. A night 3 years ago that was just as cold but significantly quieter. As Im Kyu-sung stared at the pale, unconscious woman in his arms, his mind drifted back to the moment he had shattered his own soul to save hers. Back then the air hadn't smelled of blood, but of the expensive jasmine perfume Serena always wore. They had stood in her small apartment, the city lights shimmering behind her like fallen stars. He remembered the way she had looked at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying, absolute trust. She was wearing his oversized t-shirt, her hair messy from sleep, talking about their future as if it were a guaranteed sunrise. But Kyu-sung had seen the shadows closing in. He had found the death threats tucked under his windshield. He had seen the way his enemies looked at her when they thought he wasn't watching. He knew then that a man like him couldn't have a weakness, and Serena Moon was the only piece of his heart he hadn't turned to stone. "I can't do this anymore, Serena," he had said, his voice flat and robotic, a mask he had spent years perfecting. He remembered the way her smile had faltered, then vanished. He didn't look at her, he couldn't. If he saw the tears, he knew he would break. "You were a distraction. A game that went on too long." "Kyu-sung, what are you saying?" she had whispered, her voice trembling. "We're supposed to be married in a month." "I lied," he spat out, the words tasting like poison. "I never loved you. I used your family's connections to stabilize the Northern Territory, and now that the deal is closed, you're irrelevant." It was the most efficient execution he had ever performed. He watched her collapse inwardly, her face contorting in a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. He had walked out that night without looking back, convincing himself that her hatred of him would be her strongest armor. He believed that if she stayed far away from the king of the city, the devil's enemies would forget she existed. Now 3 years later, as he pressed his forehead against her cold hair in the back of the car, the irony was a jagged blade in his chest. His grand sacrifice had been for nothing. The lie that was meant to keep her safe had only left her vulnerable, standing in the crosshairs of a war she never asked to join. He had traded her love for her life, and now it seemed he had lost both. The black sedan screeched to a halt in front of a nondescript warehouse in the industrial district, where the smell of salt and rotting fish masked the hidden world of the city's back-alley medicine. Im Kyu-sung did not wait for his men to open the door. He kicked it wide, emerging into the downpour like a vengeful god. He carried Serena with a terrifying, desperate strength, her white dress now a heavy, sodden weight of crimson and rainwater. Inside, the lights flickered with a sickly yellow hue, illuminating rows of rusted shelves and the sterile, sharp scent of antiseptic that failed to cover the underlying stench of decay. "Dr. Han." Kyu-sung's voice roared through the hollow space, a sound that shattered the silence and sent a huddle of low-level thugs scattering into the shadows. From a cramped office in the back, a man emerged, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. A disgraced surgeon who had traded his license for a bottle and the protection of the mob. When he saw the blood-soaked woman in the chairman's arms, his face turned the color of ash. "Chairman, I don't have the equipment for this. She's lost too much blood. You need a real hospital," Han stammered, his voice thin and reed-like. Kyu-sung didn't argue. In one fluid, violent motion, he laid Serena on the cold, stainless steel prep table and drew the black handgun from his waistband. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged echoed like a thunderclap in the small room. He pressed the cold muzzle directly against the doctor's sweat-slicked temple, his eyes burning with a cold, murderous fire that promised no mercy. "You have two choices, Han," Kyu-sung whispered, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with a raw agony that made the doctor flinch. "You save her, or I make sure you never have to worry about your shaking hands again. I don't care about your excuses. I don't care about the odds. If her heart stops, yours will be exactly 1 second behind hers." The doctor looked from the barrel of the gun to the frail, porcelain-skinned woman who looked more like a ghost than a living being. The reality of his situation settled in. He was trapped between a dying woman and a man who had already decided to burn the world down if she didn't wake up. With trembling fingers, Han reached for a tray of surgical instruments. "Get the lights," the doctor barked, his survival instinct finally overriding his fear. Kyu-sung didn't lower the weapon. He stood there, a blood-stained sentinel in a bespoke suit, watching as the first incision was made, his heart hammering a rhythm of pure, unadulterated terror. He had commanded armies, but now his entire empire rested on the tip of a disgraced man's scalpel. The rhythmic, wet sound of the surgeon's tools against flesh was the only thing anchoring Im Kyu-sung to the present as he stood in the dim periphery of the operating light. His hands, still stained with Serena's drying blood, gripped the edge of a rusted metal cabinet so hard the steel began to groan. He was a man who lived by the mathematics of violence, and as the adrenaline of the initial shock began to recede, a cold, clinical clarity took its place. He stared at the shadow his own silhouette cast against the peeling wallpaper, a jagged dark shape that looked more like a monster than a man. His mind began to rewind the tape of the night with the precision of a predator. He thought of the exact street corner, the timing of the rain, and the trajectory of the bullet. It hadn't been a stray shot from a passing vehicle or a desperate act by a low-level thug. It was a professional hit, executed with a surgical grace that matched the doctor's current movements. But as he replayed the moment, the glass shattered. A chilling realization settled in his gut like liquid lead. He and Serena had been in a neutral zone, a place he hadn't visited in years, and his movements that night had been scrubbed from every official log. Not even his primary security detail had known the destination of the custom sedan. The assassin hadn't been following him. The assassin had been waiting for him. To be at that specific crosswalk at that specific second required more than just luck. It required an itinerary. Kyu-sung's gaze shifted from the unconscious woman on the table to the closed door where his most loyal advisors stood guard. A low, dangerous hum vibrated in his chest. For 3 years he had kept Serena in a vacuum of silence, believing that if he never spoke her name, the world would forget she was his heartbeat. But someone had been watching the watcher. Someone within the inner circle of the syndicate had been tracking his private surveillance of her, feeding on the breadcrumbs of his secret longing. The betrayal felt like a second bullet, one that didn't just pierce the skin but shredded his very foundation. He looked back at Serena, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent bulb, and felt a surge of protective rage that surpassed anything he had ever felt for his territory. They hadn't just tried to kill him, they had used the only light in his life as bait. As the surgeon pulled a twisted piece of lead from Serena's shoulder, Kyu-sung reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his internal security lead. The king was no longer just grieving, he was hunting. And he would start by burning down every shadow that thought it could hide within his own walls. The smell of antiseptic and old blood remained thick in the air, but Im Kyu-sung was no longer a man paralyzed by grief. He had reverted to the cold, calculating machine that had conquered the soul underworld. Leaving Serena under the watchful, terrified eyes of Dr. Han, he stepped into the hallway where his lead investigator, a man whose shadow was as long as his reach, was already waiting. Much like Damien Moretti had done in his own crisis, Kyu-sung bypassed the usual channels of authority, leaning instead on the dark, efficient machinery of his private intelligence network. "The shooter," Kyu-sung said, his voice a low vibration that carried the promise of a slow death. "I want his name, his bloodline, and the hand that fed him." His investigator slid a tablet across the cold metal surface of a nearby table. A single grainy image of a black SUV and a GPS ping from a burner phone appeared on the screen. The signal had originated from a bodega in a district Kyu-sung didn't technically own, a neutral ground that was increasingly becoming a staging area for a silent coup. Like the investigation into the threats against Ivana, the trail was designed to be a dead end, but Kyu-sung's resources were vast enough to see through the smoke. He ordered a cross-reference of every encrypted communication that had bypassed the syndicate's firewall in the last 48 hours. +1. As the data scrolled past, bank transfers, scrambled text logs, and high-resolution satellite footage, the pattern became undeniable. The assassin hadn't just appeared. He had been positioned with the surgical precision that only someone with Kyu-sung's own itinerary could provide. Every loyal lieutenant and every trusted advisor was suddenly a suspect. Kyu-sung watched the blinking red dot of the burner phone's last known location, his fingers crushing the edge of the tablet. "Find the bodega owner," Kyu-sung commanded, his eyes turning to flint. "If he doesn't remember the face of the man who bought that phone, burn his shop with him inside. I want the origin of that signal." He wasn't just looking for a gunman anymore. He was looking for the heart of the betrayal that had dared to use Serena Moon as a target. Like a predator tracking a scent through a storm, Kyu-sung began to tighten the noose, indifferent to the war he was about to start. He had spent 3 years lying to protect her. Now he would spend the rest of his life destroying the men who made those lies necessary. The low hum of the medical monitor was the only sound in the cramped, windowless room as the heavy sedative finally began to lose its grip. Serena Moon's eyelids fluttered, a jagged breath catching in her throat as she drifted back into a consciousness she hadn't asked for. The first thing she felt wasn't the searing agony in her shoulder, but the crushing weight of a presence she recognized in her very marrow. She turned her head slowly, her vision blurry and swimming with the shadows of the underground clinic. As the world came into focus, she saw him. Im Kyu-sung sat in a wooden chair beside the cot, his silhouette dark and imposing against the flickering fluorescent light. He looked nothing like the untouchable king of Seoul. His custom jacket was discarded, his sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms stained with her blood, and his face was a mask of raw, unfiltered anguish. For a moment, the 3 years of silence vanished. The memory of the bullet, the rain, and the cold pavement felt distant compared to the sudden, sharp proximity of the man who had systematically dismantled her life. She looked into his eyes that were currently filled with a desperate, pleading hope, and felt a flare of pain that made the physical wound in her flesh seem like a mercy. "Kyu-sung," she whispered, her voice a dry, hollow rasp. He leaned forward instinctively, his hand reaching out to touch her brow, his fingers trembling with a vulnerability that would have shocked his enemies. "I'm here, Serena. You're safe. I've got you." Serena flinched away from his touch, the small movement sending a bolt of white-hot lightning through her nerves, but she didn't care. The sight of him wasn't a comfort. It was a reminder of the night he had looked her in the eye and told her she was irrelevant. It was the memory of the lie he had used to exile her into a world where she was forced to survive alone, only to be dragged back into his violence. "Don't," she gasped, her eyes filling with tears that burned hotter than the fever in her skin. "Why are you here? Why did you let me see you?" "I couldn't let you go," he choked out, the words ripped from a chest that hadn't breathed properly since the shooting. Serena let out a weak, bitter laugh that turned into a cough, staining her lips with a fleck of red. "You let me go 3 years ago, Kyu-sung. You threw me away like a distraction. To see you now, to have you holding me after you broke me." She closed her eyes tight, a sob racking her frail frame. "The bullet was faster. Seeing you, this is the real kill." Kyu-sung sat frozen, his hands hovering in the empty air between them, shattered by the realization that his presence was the very poison she couldn't survive. He had fought the entire city to keep her heart beating, only to realize that every beat was now an echo of the pain he had caused. The heavy metallic door of the clinic's makeshift office slammed shut, sealing Im Kyu-sung inside a tomb of cold data and hot rage. Outside the room, Serena had drifted back into a pained, fitful sleep, her words of accusation still ringing in his ears like a death knell. But inside this room, the most feared man in the city was hunting a different kind of ghost. He stared at the decrypted files provided by his lead investigator, his eyes narrowing as the digital breadcrumbs began to form a lethal trail back to his own inner sanctum. The GPS logs from the burner phone had been cross-referenced with the syndicate's internal security clearances, and the result was a jagged blade to his heart. The clearance code used to bypass the firewall, the one that had allowed the assassin to track Kyu-sung's secret visits to Serena for 3 years, belonged to his most trusted advisor, the man who had stood at his right hand while he built his empire. This wasn't a betrayal born of greed, but of a cold, twisted ideology. A series of recorded conversations played through the laptop speakers, the voice of his advisor sounding like dry parchment. "The chairman has grown soft," the man whispered to a group of dissenting lieutenants. "He wastes our resources watching a baker who is nothing to us. He has forgotten that a king is only as strong as his lack of mercy. If he won't cut the anchor himself, we will do it for him." Kyu-sung felt the world tilt. For 3 years he had operated on the belief that his isolation was his strength, never realizing that his silence had been interpreted as weakness. His advisor hadn't just leaked their location. He had orchestrated the hit to cure Kyu-sung of his humanity. The man had watched Kyu-sung's internal agony with a smile, waiting for the moment Serena's death would turn the chairman back into a heartless monster. Kyu-sung's hand crushed a glass of whiskey sitting on the desk, the shards drawing fresh blood that mixed with the drying stains on his cuffs. The advisor thought he was making a king stronger, but he had instead awakened a devil that no code could contain. Kyu-sung reached for his phone, his voice a low, lethal vibration that signaled the start of a purge. "Gather the men who are still loyal," he commanded. "The house is infested. We're going to burn every traitor who thought they could touch my life and survive it." The cold weight of the night pressed against the windows of the armored vehicle as Im Kyu-sung moved toward a meeting he never thought he would entertain. To save Serena and purge the rot from his own ranks, he had to step into the lion's den of his greatest enemy. The neutral zone was a derelict shipping yard where the air tasted of salt rust and the impending storm that refused to break. Waiting for him, silhouetted against the flickering floodlights, was Park Jin-woo, the rival boss who had been trying to claim Kyu-sung's northern docks for nearly a decade. Jin-woo stood with a smug, predatory grace, surrounded by men whose hands hovered near their holsters. In any other circumstance, this encounter would have ended in a bloodbath, but tonight, Kyu-sung was a man who had already lost his world. He had nothing left to fear. Moretti had his docks and I have mine, Kyu-sung stated, his voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the sound of the churning sea. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply slid a map across the hood of a car. A map that detailed the full handover of the Northern Territory, a kingdom Jin-woo had spent millions trying to conquer. Jin-woo's eyes narrowed as he looked at the deed. You're giving up the crown jewel of your empire, Kyu-sung. Why, what could be worth this much? The names, Kyu-sung replied, his eyes turning to flint. I know your network has been intercepting the encrypted communications from my inner circle. You have the logs of the traitors who fed my location to the assassin. Jin-woo laughed, a dry, mocking sound. You're trading an empire for a woman you once threw away? They were right, you have gone soft. Kyu-sung stepped into Jin-woo's space. The movement so sudden and violent that the rivals' guards drew their weapons. Kyu-sung didn't blink. I am not soft, Jin-woo. I am focused. I am stripping away everything that matters to me except for her. You get the territory, but I get the heads of the men who touched her. Do we have a deal, or do I burn this yard with both of us inside? Jin-woo studied the raw, murderous desperation in Kyu-sung's face and recognized a man who had stopped playing the game of kings and started playing the game of ghosts. He signaled his man to hand over a manila envelope. The ledgers and the recordings, Jin-woo said, his voice dropping an octave. It seems your most trusted advisor has been very busy. He didn't just want her dead, he wanted you replaced. Kyu-sung gripped the envelope, the paper crinkling under his blood-stained fingers. The trade was complete. He had sacrificed half his kingdom for a handful of names, but as he turned back toward the hospital fortress where Serena lay, he felt a cold, deadly calm. He was no longer a boss protecting his assets. He was a father of a new life, ready to burn the old one down to the ground. The sterile white walls of the medical wing felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb as Serena Moon struggled to her feet, her hand clutching the four-pole for support. Every movement was a battle against the white-hot agony in her shoulder, but the suffocation of Im Kyu-sung's presence was a far greater weight. She had seen the armed guards stationed at the end of the hallway, men in dark suits with cold eyes, the same kind of men who had made her life a nightmare 3 years ago. Like Damien Moretti's gilded cage, this fortress was designed to keep the world out, but it was also designed to keep her in. She was nearly at the heavy oak doors of the foyer when Kyu-sung appeared, his presence instantly sucking the air out of the room. He had discarded his jacket, his white shirt stained with the grime of his meeting with Jin-woo, looking like a man who had walked through hell only to find his home on fire. Where do you think you're going? He demanded, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that shook the air between them. Away from you, Serena gasped, her face pale and damp with the effort of walking. I won't be another one of your assets, Kyu-sung. I won't stay in a house where the windows are bulletproof because the man inside is a monster. Kyu-sung moved with a predatory speed, closing the distance until he was towering over her, his hands hovering as if he wanted to catch her but feared his touch would shatter what was left of her. It's not safe out there, Serena. The men who did this, they are still hunting. My protection is the only thing keeping your heart beating. Your protection is what put a bullet in me, she screamed, the force of her voice causing her to stagger. You lied to me for 3 years to save me, and all it did was leave me alone in the dark while your enemies used me for target practice. This isn't protection, Kyu-sung. It's possession. Kyu-sung's face contorted, the mask of the most feared man in the city, finally cracking to reveal the raw, bleeding wound underneath. I am trying to fix it, he roared, a broken sound tearing out of his chest. I traded half my empire tonight just for the names of the men who touched you. I am burning my world down so you can breathe. Then let me go, Serena whispered, her tears finally spilling over. If you really want to save me, let me go. Because the only thing more dangerous than your enemies is the way you love me. Kyu-sung stood frozen, his chest heaving as he realized that no matter how many bulletproof windows he installed, he could never protect her from the trauma of his own shadow. The digital evidence provided by Jin-woo flickered on the monitor in Kyu-sung's private study, casting a cold blue light over his grim features. As he scrolled through the intercepted logs, the final piece of the betrayal clicked into place with the sickening sound of a trap snapping shut. He had spent 3 years believing his distance was Serena's greatest shield, but the data revealed a much darker reality. The leaks hadn't started with a random security breach. They had started because Kyu-sung himself had broken his own rule of isolation. The logs showed that every time Kyu-sung had sat in his darkened car 2 blocks away from her bakery, or every time he had accessed the hidden street cameras to watch her walk home in the evening, his chief of staff had been monitoring the metadata. His advisor hadn't just guessed her importance. He had used Kyu-sung's own secret longing as a GPS to find his only weakness. "You led them to her," Kyu-sung whispered, the realization hitting him harder than any physical blow. The very act of watching over her from the shadows, the tiny fragments of protection he allowed himself, had left a digital trail for the assassins to follow. A recorded memo from his advisor's private server played through the speakers, the voice chillingly pragmatic. "The chairman is compromised. He is no longer watching the borders, he is watching a ghost. If he cannot stop looking at her, then we must remove the object of his obsession. Once she is gone, he will return to the throne." Kyu-sung's hand tightened around the edge of the mahogany desk until the wood groaned. The irony was a jagged shard in his throat. By refusing to let her go completely, by secretly hovering in her periphery like a guardian angel, he had actually painted a bullseye on her back. His love had been the very thing that signaled the predators. He stood up, the chair clattering behind him as he stared at the security feed of Serena's room in the East Wing. She was sitting by the window looking out at the iron gates she so desperately wanted to pass. He had thought he was a king protecting his queen, but the truth revealed he was a man whose own shadow had become her executioner. "Never again," he vowed, his voice a low, lethal promise that vibrated through the silent room. He wasn't just going to purge the traitors, he was going to burn down the entire system that made her a target for his sins. The siren didn't wail. It was the sudden, violent shattering of glass that announced the end of the silence. Im Kyu-sung was at Serena's bedside when the first concussive blast rocked the foundations of the clinic. The traitors had realized their window was closing. They weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to erase the evidence of their betrayal, and that meant Serena could not leave the building alive. Kyu-sung reacted with the lethal instinct of a man who had spent his life navigating the kill zone. He didn't flinch. In one fluid motion, he flipped the heavy oak table to provide cover, his hand already gripping the cold steel of his weapon. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that carried more authority than the explosions outside. The hallway erupted into a symphony of gunfire and shouts. Kyu-sung stepped out into the corridor, a blood-stained sentinel in a ruined suit, and unleashed a calculated fury. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was a war for the very soul of the city. He moved through the smoke with a ghostly precision, his muzzle flashes illuminating the terrified faces of the men he had once called brothers. Every shot he fired was a punctuation mark on a 3-year-old apology. Outside, the industrial district began to glow with the orange hue of rising flames. The traitors had set the perimeter on fire, attempting to smoke him out, but Kyu-sung only fought harder. He was a man who had already lost his kingdom, leaving him with nothing but the raw, primitive need to protect the woman behind the door. He took a bullet to the shoulder, the impact spinning him around, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He fought through the lobby, his footsteps heavy on the glass-strewn floor, until the last of the intruders lay silent in the rain. The city was burning, the smoke from the warehouse fires mingling with the heavy downpour to create a choking gray veil. Kyu-sung stood in the center of the wreckage, his chest heaving, his shirt soaked in a mixture of his own blood and the rain. He looked back at the door where Serena was hidden. The advisor had thought this war would break him, but it had only forged him into something unbreakable. He had burned his empire to the ground, and in the ashes he was finally ready to face the truth. The fires at the industrial district were still smoldering when Im Kyu-sung transitioned his war from the physical to the digital. He sat in a temporary command center, his wounded shoulder bound in white gauze that was already beginning to bloom with fresh red. For years he had lived by the code of the bullet, but as he stared at the face of his chief of staff on the monitors, he realized that a quick death was a mercy his advisor didn't deserve. To truly destroy a man who valued legacy and strength above all else, Kyu-sung wouldn't stop his heart. He would erase his existence. With a single keystroke, the public execution began. Kyu-sung didn't leak the information to a tabloid or an anonymous blog. He used the syndicate's own high-security emergency broadcast system, a channel reserved for the highest level of Mafia summits, to send a burst of encrypted data simultaneously to every major crime family in Asia and the National Police headquarters. The screen flickered to life across 1,000 devices. It wasn't a video of a hit, it was a cold, clinical trail of evidence. The ledgers showed the advisor's secret embezzlements. The audio files played his voice as he negotiated the hit on Serena with Kyu-sung's rivals. The GPS logs proved he had violated the sanctity of the chairman's private life. In the underworld, betrayal of a boss's family is a sin that carries no statute of limitations. In the legitimate world, money laundering and conspiracy to murder carry a life sentence. Within minutes, the advisor's name became a radioactive brand. His bank accounts were frozen by the authorities, and his loyal lieutenants were being hunted by the very rivals he had tried to court. Kyu-sung watched as the man's face appeared on the breaking news, his clean reputation as a business consultant dissolving in real time. He didn't need to fire another shot. By the time the police arrived at the advisor's safe house, the man was already a ghost, stripped of his power, his money, and his honor. He was a man with nowhere left to run, abandoned by the criminals who feared the chairman's wrath and pursued by a law he could no longer bribe. Kyu-sung closed the laptop, the blue light fading from his tired eyes. The advisor had wanted to make Kyu-sung a heartless king. Instead, he had watched from his knees as the king destroyed the very concept of the throne. The transition of power did not happen in a boardroom or a gilded hall. It happened in the same rain-swept shipping yard where the trade for Serena's life had begun. The storm had finally slowed to a rhythmic, mournful drizzle, the kind that seemed to weep for the end of an era. Im Kyu-sung stood alone at the edge of the pier, his silhouette no longer radiating the sharp, predatory threat of a king, but the quiet, heavy stillness of a man who had finally seen the bottom of his own soul. Park Jin-woo arrived with the full weight of his entourage, the headlights of a dozen black SUVs cutting through the mist like the eyes of hungry wolves. He stepped out, looking at Kyu-sung with a mix of triumph and wary respect. He had waited a decade to see this man fall, but he hadn't expected Kyu-sung to walk off the cliff of his own free will. The ledgers, the encryption keys, and the deeds to every warehouse from the docks to the border, Kyu-sung said, his voice a low, steady vibration that lacked the jagged edge of his previous rage. He handed over a single heavy titanium briefcase. It's all there. The Moretti Syndicate, everything I built, everything I bled for, it's yours. Jin-woo gripped the handle, his knuckles white. You're really doing it. You're handing me the keys to the city for a woman who might never forgive you. I'm not handing you a city, Jin-woo. I'm handing you a cage, Kyu-sung replied, looking out at the dark horizon where the sea met the sky. I spent 3 years thinking this power was the only thing that could keep her safe. I was wrong. The power was the target. The throne was the reason she almost died. He turned his back on the rival boss, a move that would have been a death sentence only a week ago. But tonight, Kyu-sung didn't care about the guns or the territory. He walked toward his car, his steps light for the first time in years. Behind him, the keys to the city were nothing more than cold metal and digital codes. As he drove away from the shipping yard, he stripped the expensive platinum watch from his wrist and tossed it into the back seat. He was no longer the chairman. He was no longer the most feared man in Seoul. He arrived back at the clinic as the sun began to bleed through the gray clouds. He walked into Serena's room not as a captor or a king, but as a man who had finally cleared the space for a second chance. He knelt by her bed, taking her pale hand in his, a hand no longer stained by the business of death. It's over, he whispered into the quiet room. The war is gone. The throne is ash. Never again will I fail you, Serena. Because from this moment on, there is nothing left to come between us. The high-rise glass towers and the suffocating scent of exhaust were a lifetime away, replaced by the soft, earthy fragrance of damp soil and blooming jasmine. In a quiet coastal village far from the neon-soaked shadows of Seoul, the morning sun broke through the mist, casting a gentle golden light over a garden that knew nothing of syndicates or blood debts. Im Kyu-sung stood by a low stone wall, his hands tucked into the pockets of a simple linen shirt. There were no bespoke suits today, no polished cufflinks, and no heavy weight of a concealed weapon against his ribs. The scars on his shoulder still pulled when the weather changed, but the jagged edges of his soul had finally begun to smooth over. He watched Serena as she knelt among the flower beds, her movements graceful and free of the haunting tremor that had plagued her in the weeks following the surgery. She looked up and caught his gaze, a genuine soft smile touching her lips, a sight that was worth more to him than every territory he had ever conquered. "The soil is perfect today," she said, her voice clear and no longer a ghost of a rasp. Kyu-sung walked over and knelt beside her, his knees pressing into the dirt. He didn't mind the grime. It was honest, a stark contrast to the slick, treacherous filth of the life he had left behind. He reached out, his hand steady as he brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. For years he had believed that power was a wall he had to build to keep the world out. He had thought that being a king meant being untouchable. But as he looked at Serena, he realized that true power was the courage to be vulnerable, to trade an empire of fear for a single acre of peace. The man who had once been the most feared mafia boss in the city was gone, buried under the wreckage of the warehouse fire and the titanium briefcase he had handed to Jinwoo. In his place was a man who understood that the only war worth winning was the one for the person you loved. He wasn't guarding a throne anymore, he was guarding a home. As the sound of the distant waves mirrored the steady beat of his heart, Kyu-sung took Serena's hand in his. The vow he had made in the rain, that he would never fail her again, wasn't a burden he carried. It was the light that guided him. He had lost an empire of crime, but as they sat together in the warmth of the morning sun, he knew he had finally risen as something much stronger. He had found his kingdom of love, and this time he was never letting go. Story description. The story follows Im Kyu-sung, a powerful and feared Korean mafia boss who has spent 3 years living in emotional isolation after pushing away his fiancée, Serena Moon, to protect her from his violent life. He believed that lying to her, claiming he never loved her, would keep her safe from his enemies, but this choice backfires when an assassin's bullet intended for him strikes Serena instead.